So let's see by the end of the hour, when we have talked about conflicts, then maybe you will be hugely excited about it and going around, and you can't wait until you get to your next conflict. So yeah, but maybe Sarah, do you want to say a little bit about, give a little bit of an introduction? What is conflict?
So, yes, you might know Klaus and I are running this series of webinars. And if you take them all together, this one we're focusing in, as you know, on conflict. But they're all about how do you create a culture of dialogue in organisations, indeed, those safe spaces where people can talk about what really matters rather than leaving things to fester and get worse because we run away from talking about the difficult stuff, or we try to talk about it and it just ends up as a bit of a car crash. So what Klaus and I intended to do with this webinar was just to set some context around dialogue and conflict, and then get into some tools, 3 key tools for helping us to navigate this difficult territory. Even if we could do it a little bit better, even if you might take just a micro practice from one of those tools, I really hope it will help you with your team, in your organisation and with your work. So, just to set the scene here, I'm sure that many of you might have come across the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. It's been a bit of a bestseller. I'm not going to go through all the 5 dysfunctions, but I'm just going to mention a couple of them. The foundational one is around lack of trust, when you haven't got psychological safety in a team. And when trust is missing, you're straight into the next dysfunction, which is fear of conflict. So conflict, building trust, they're very closely related. And this is a quote from Patrick Lencioni's book. He says, actually, if you could get people in organisations rowing in the same direction, then you could dominate any industry in any market against any competition at any time. I think that's a very American way of talking about the benefits of alignment. You might also know the phrase from therapy, the only way out is through. As in, and this applies to conflict, the only way really we're going to find our way through conflict is by navigating it, by leaning in and creating that alignment. Here's one other quote. This time it's from a US general. This is George Patton speaking, and he says, when everyone is thinking alike, then someone isn't thinking. And of course, that's pointing to the value of having diverse perspectives. Klaus and I, in our webinar last week, and I know some of you were with us last week, we were looking at the value of digging into different perspectives and actually how we increase collective intelligence by doing that, by having the diversity in the room. But again, we're only going to be able to increase collective wisdom if we can navigate the tension that can arise from different perspectives. So if we just take a look then at this notion of conflict, dictionary definitions of conflict say things like it's an active disagreement between people with opposing views. That's the Cambridge English Dictionary definition. The Business Dictionary defines conflict at work as friction or opposition resulting from perceived or actual differences or incompatibilities. And I think the thing to get about conflict is it's not just about difference of opinion, it's about difference of opinion when there is tension in the room. And it's how we really deal with the tension in the room that makes the critical difference here. Of course, it's very natural for people to see things differently. Tension arises when we see those differences in perspective as a problem. And so the question is, how do we handle tension? And that means tension in ourselves, tension maybe between us and one other person, or indeed tension in the room. And so conflict, and I think this has already been pointed to in our introductions, can have both positive and negative connotations. So I'm just going to invite you, if you're willing and would like to use the chat and to put into the chat words or phrases you associate with negative conflict, with that sort of unhealthy version of conflict. So just what comes to mind, or you might think about what the costs are of unhealthy conflict. So just love to have your response. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, defensive. People get defensive. From Lisa, contraction. Yeah, there's a sense of us going small, going tense. Winning and losing. Yeah, it can really set up that dynamic that I win, you lose, or vice versa. Khalid, entrenchment. Yeah, so people can end up taking really fixed positions, retreating to their corner. Yes, there might be a real sense of danger, and that for some of us will make us fight harder, and for some of us will then run to the hills. Stuckness as well, that sense of issues not getting resolved, not getting talked about, or we try and talk about them and then it gets worse. Power seeking. Yes, particularly if we're perceived as becoming more controlling as our defensive reaction towards conflict. And there's more coming in now. I might not catch everyone, but the fear and anxiety. Yes, so in the face of conflict, some of us, get more controlling. Others of us withdraw, we distance ourselves, we go silent because it doesn't feel safe to protect ourselves. And other people, the defensive response is to become quite people-pleasing and to go into kind of compliance because it just feels too risky to rock the boat. So I'm now going to ask you for the other side, and again, I'd love to hear your language, your words for the positive dimension of conflict, when conflict is healthy, what the impact is of being able to navigate differences in viewpoint, diversity in the room, tension arises. So as Paul says, yes, it can be stimulating. It can be very energizing. The meeting isn't boring anymore. Thank you, Joe. It could lead to creativity, fresh insights. Thank you, Dilesh, getting to a fresh perspective. That could be expansive. It could expand our thinking. We're now thinking outside the box. Seeing solutions that maybe we haven't seen before, getting to new ideas, getting to what's beneath the surface. There's some great responses coming in here. Reframing, very good. Just seeing the problem situation in a different way. So new insights, fresh solutions. And so we can do better decision making, better problem solving if we find ways of managing conflict. And that can lead to learning for all, indeed, because we all have limitations in how we see things. So this is going to bring us on to our 3 tools for navigating conflict so that we can be greater than the sum of our parts, to borrow Joe's turn of phrase there. Maybe just before I hand back to Claus, and Claus will talk us through a couple of these tools, and I'll complete with the third one. Any questions or comments on what we've covered so far? Well, Claus, is there anything I've missed in the chat? If you've had your eye on that, I don't know if I covered everything that came in. You're giving me the thumbs up there. Thank you. Maybe I'll just hand across to you, Claus, then, and you could talk us through a couple of tools for turning tension into triumph, to pick up on our title here.
Yes, thanks. So yeah, the tools that I'm going to cover, the two tools are really tools for getting curious. As you wrote in the chats, when conflict is negative, we are normally not curious. We're just concerned about how to protect ourselves. We become defensive, and we're not very curious about the other person. And if you have two people and talking and neither are curious about the other's viewpoint, they're just trying to persuade the other person to see things from their perspective, you get these entrenchment wars. And they are so common in organizations. They can last for a very long time, and they really drag down the performance level. So how do you help yourself become curious? I think the first tool is to make visible the positive intention from each side. Even if there are other motivations. So one of the things I often see with when I work with managers and they have a conflict with somebody else, and you ask managers, what is your theory about why they behave like that? So many times they will say one of a few different answers. They will say it's because they are stupid and they don't see the full picture, or it is because they are somehow they have their own interest in mind but not the organization's interest in mind, so they are selfish, or they are something else. It's these very negative interpretations or theories about why other people behave the way they behave. It's very rare that people can actually have a hypothesis that involves a positive intention, maybe a positive but unrealized motivation. And I think one of the things that's really important to remember here is many times as human beings, our behavior can be motivated by several things at the same time. So if you're doing something, you're arguing a particular side, and you say, well, if that was true, it would be really good for you. That might not be the only motivation that somebody has. Somebody can have their own best interest and the organization's best interest in mind at the same time. So you can be motivated by multiple things at the same time. Now, if you decide to focus on the part of your interlocutor's motivation that is a positive intention that you can get behind, it is something that can really open up the dialogue and turn the dialogue from an entrenchment war into a creative and productive disagreement. So usually I like to, like when we work with dialogue, the capacity that you have to develop in order to do this is the capacity for respecting. So in dialogue we have these 4 different practices, and one of the practices is respecting. The practice of respecting allows you to contradict somebody or oppose somebody else's idea in a way that is more likely to lead to a productive conversation. And in order to do that, there are 2 things to keep in mind. So this tool is very much a mindset tool, you can say. The first thing is exactly what I was talking about. Just assume that there is something valuable in what the other person is saying, even or especially if it doesn't come through in what they're saying. And I'm gonna share a story that reveals more about what I mean when I say that. The second thing is assume that you cannot fully understand the other person's perspective. This is a mistake that I often see also when I work with managers. They will say, well, I understand why the other person is saying what they're saying because they see it from this side, and I understand all of that. So you kind of pretend to fully understand the other person's perspective, and then you say, but they don't understand my perspective because they don't have my experience, they don't have they don't have the information I have access to, they don't have they're not as smart as me, or whatever it is. Now, again, as human beings, we can never fully understand another person's perspective because we haven't lived their life. You can't you can be great at empathizing, you can be great at seeing things from another person's perspective, but there's always that possibility that there is something you didn't get about it because you are not them. So when we have these two assumptions together, that gives us a really good starting point for being curious about what is the other person trying to say. There must be something valuable in there, even if they're not formulating it super well, communicating it very well. And I have to listen to them to understand it, because I can't rely on my own capacity to just see things from their perspective. I have to ask questions, I have to listen. One situation that I think illustrates this really nicely is once I was out working with a group of people. It was an organization that went into elementary schools, and they had conversations with teachers and students and parents about alcohol consumption, and in particular when to start alcohol consumption. Now, there's a lot of research that shows that the later people start drinking alcohol, the better. It just solves a whole bunch of potential problems in society and in personal life. It's just good to start drinking later in life, when your brains are more developed, when you have more, when you have more maturity and so on. And so they said they had a problem, because sometimes when they went out and they facilitated these conversations in schools, they would meet a certain kind of person. And this kind of person would say, well, I started drinking when I was 6, never done me any harm. And also look at Frank or whatever, his parents are the strictest and he's the one that drinks the most. So it doesn't work to try and control your kids' alcohol consumption. They should just figure it out for themselves. And by the way, I think all the research is biased and I don't believe in it. Right? And so these people were like, what do you do when this is the person that you're talking to? And maybe even if you're not working with alcohol consumption, you can probably relate to how many have colleagues where you say, yeah, I can kind of recognize this is the kind of person that I'm talking to. It's just any good argument just falls flat. They don't believe in information that is clearly true, all these kind of things. Do you know these kind of people? No, I'm the only one who came across. Okay, some people are nodding. Otherwise, I wouldn't know why you were here. But so then we started talking about it. And unfortunately, the people who in question were not in the room, so we had to rely on our capacity to empathize. But we say, let's first of all assume that there is something valuable in what they are saying, even though it comes out in a little bit of a clunky way and they have some arguments that are not really convincing, but let's assume that there is a positive intention somewhere. What might it be? And then we seized on this sentence that they would say that the persons in the class whose parents are the strictest is also the person that drinks the most and seems most out of control. And if you listen to that, you can kind of get, they are concerned with something here. They are concerned with, if I put restrictions on my child, I might damage the relationship to the child, and then I will have no influence over them anymore. And actually, that's a fair thing to say, right? if you're a parent, you want to be able to have conversations with your children. You want to be able to not be perceived as somebody who's just super strict and therefore somebody that the child cannot go to and discuss their problems. You want to have that connection. That's actually really fair. And it elevates the conversation, because now the conversation is not just about what are the rules that should be enforced, that we should agree on enforcing. We have to expand it with yet another question, which is, how should we enforce the rules in a way that preserves the parents' relationship to the children? That's a very important contribution to the conversation. And even if it was formulated in a way that just was very easy to dismiss, but when we got curious and said, what is the positive intention? We see actually they're onto something that was missing from the conversation. So if we have, this is the first tool. Ask yourself, what is the positive intention? And don't stop asking until you find something that you can really get behind, where you say, this is actually a really good point. Many times my advice is to say, if you're talking to somebody and they seem to be making a point that is a little bit out there, ask yourself, can I formulate my opponent's point of view better than they can do? Can I not just understand what my opponent is saying, but can I give my opponent's point of view a stronger formulation than my opponent is doing? Imagine what that would do to you if you have a conflict with somebody and all of a sudden they articulate your point of view better than you do it. Can you feel how you will be very open to listening to them? This is something that really opens ears if you can do that. So this is the first tool. Make visible the positive intention of each side and try to give your opponent's positive intention a stronger articulation than your opponent is doing him or herself. Good. The second tool that we are going to look at is a little bit like the flip side. Let me just see, there's a question here. Are you suggesting verbalizing that stronger articulation to the other? Yes, absolutely. That's a good question. Yes, and sometimes you can do, when you want to verbalize your opponent's viewpoint and you think you can verbalize it in an even stronger way, you can start by saying, okay, so what I understand from what you're saying is, or if I should express what I hear you saying. It's a little bit like what I hear you saying is, but maybe use a slightly more fresh formulation than that formulation. So you can say something like, if I understand you right, what you are saying is, and then you try out your articulation. You might get them wrong. Maybe they're gonna say, no, that's not what I said at all. And then back to listening. But if you manage to give them a stronger, they're gonna say, yes, finally somebody's understanding me. And then they will be much more engaged in the dialogue. And the dialogue will be elevated because something valuable was brought in. You helped them bring it in. And they couldn't bring it in themselves, maybe because they wasn't able to give it that strong articulation. Good, great question. And please bring your questions as I'm talking. It's very nice. So the second tool is kind of the flip side. So rather than making visible the positive intention in your opponent's viewpoint, make visible the unintended negative effects in your own viewpoint. Or rather, maybe I should say, make visible the unintended negative impact of each side of the conversation. If we were looking before at the conversation around alcohol, you can say, well, actually, if we just impose rules, sort of strict rules, there is a risk of damaging the relationship, and that would mean that we lose our possibility of influencing our children. That is a real problem. On the other side, if we don't have any conversations and we don't enforce any sort of rules, that there are definitely some drawbacks on that as well. People can get very drunk, get into different kinds of trouble. There's all sorts of, if we don't have any common rules, there might be peer pressure involved, and the children won't have the rules to sort of support them if they want to set boundaries for the peer pressure. It's easy to see what the problems are. I like to think about this as if you think about organizations, no plan is perfect. Doesn't matter. You can have the greatest strategy. There are drawbacks. No plan is perfect. This is something that I have one foot in academia, and so sometimes I write the papers for publication in academic journals, and you learn a lot about criticizing your own work. And if you don't criticize your own work very well, the reviewers will do it for you. And so you get very good at spotting the flaws in your own work. And it's sort of like in academia that's just a thing. You know, no piece of research is perfect. There's always flaws. There's always something. And if you can criticize your own work and see the flaws in your own conclusions, that is met with, that gives you more respect. And I think this is good to take that attitude into organizations as well. If you present a strategy, rather than just saying, here are all the reasons why this is a great plan, you yourself say, these are the weak spots in the plan, but overall, I think the strong points outweigh the weak points, and I think this is the level of confidence I have once I have weighed the pros and cons. I think that is a sign of real maturity. And so when you have conflicts, of course, it's almost, when we are in these entrenched spaces, it's almost like the last thing you want to do is admit to any flaws in your viewpoint. But it's really important to do it. And you can do it in a way, and then if the other person says, see, you have flaw, you go like, yeah, but so do you, like, right? It's like, this is not, it's not an invitation to throw out my plan, but it is an invitation to have a real dialogue. So once I was working with a manager who was working in a public sector organization, and she had a conflict with one of her colleagues because they had a fundamental different viewpoint on what should you do with the plans handed down to you from the politicians. She says, well, new election, new government, and they want to sort of put their stamp on everything and show how great they are. And so all of a sudden, a lot of things have to be changed, and the new ideas are not always very good. Oh, we have a grandson waking up. Excellent. So she said, well, as experts, we have a responsibility to challenge the politicians. And her colleague said, no. As employees in public sector organization, our job is to implement whatever the politicians want us to implement. And so they had a lot of clashes like that. Now, here again, if you want a real good conversation, it's very important to say, okay, what's the negative side of each of these viewpoints? And on the one hand, you can say, well, if you just implement everything that the politicians tell you to implement. You are actually experts, and as such, you are obliged to, you have a responsibility to bring your expertise to the table. You're sort of like the organizational memory. You might remember what several administrations have done and tried, and you should bring that to the table. It's almost like a civic responsibility you have. On the other side, you are not an elected politician. So actually, you don't have the mandate or the authority to enforce your ideas. So if you agree with the opposition, tough luck. You can voice your opinion, but there's also a limit to how much you can push back here, because, well, we have democracy. So can you see how, if you, and this is just like me thinking, right? It's like, I'm sure the people in the room can find better flaws. But if this gives us a much more interesting starting point for a conversation, having these flaws out in the open and say, we know there are pros and cons of each side. Now let's talk. So that's the second tool, making visible the downside or the flaws on each side. Good. So those were two tools, making visible the positive intentions and making visible the potential flaws on each side of the conversation. That gives you a really good starting point for having a dialogue. And so I'll hand it back to Sarah, and you have some good input on cross-model dialogue.
Yeah, thank you very much, Claus. It's a great reminder, no plan is perfect, to think through the flaws in our own thinking. And you were also reminding me, Claus, on your first tool there, that I've actually tried to stop myself in conversation saying things like, I totally understand what you're saying, or I fully, because the reality is, and this is, Claus, what you've been saying, I can't fully understand ever what another human being really thinks and is going through. And I think these little disciplines can be really helpful for dialogue. So I'm going to cover one other tool, and then we want to open it out, and we'd love to hear your comments, your questions, your reflections. And so the third tool is this notion of a cross-model conversation. And this comes out of the work of David Cantor. He was a family therapist early on in his career, and later on he did organisational work. I had the good fortune of training with him directly about 10 years ago, and there's such wisdom in his approach. Some of you might know his book, Reading the Room, and if you're interested in cross-model conversation, that's the main place to go to. So I'm going to just share with you the key dimensions of this approach. And I'm also just going to share that it's been close to my own heart recently. When I think about examples or tell stories in webinars or in my writing, I often talk about teams or organisations. But this one is close to my heart recently because of a personal situation. I'll just say a little bit about that briefly and then come to these dimensions and then maybe loop back to this more personal story. And this is to do with a conflict that has arisen recently between my 3 siblings and myself. There's 4 of us in the family, and my mum recently had a serious operation. There were complications. We thought we were going to lose her. She ended up in intensive care, but is now home and needing care. My dad is around, but the conflict between my siblings and myself was about extra care for my parents and what was the best way of going about that. So there was lots of emotion, there was lots of positive intentions, but we were coming at it quite differently. You could say we had different models about how care for elderly people, in this case our parents, works. And David Cantor would counsel reframing a conflict as the need to have a cross-model conversation. So it becomes less personal. It's less about me and what my big sister thinks or what me and my younger brother thinks. It's more about exploring the differences in our model. And I think the overall orientation here is coming from a place, and this is from the work of Neil Donald Walsh, who says, nobody does anything wrong given their model of the world. I find that a profound statement. Nobody does anything wrong given their model of the world. So it then behooves us to work out what their model of the world is, and indeed what our own model is. And David Cantor actually advocates, when we have one of these cross-model conversations in the workplace or in a team setting, that we cultivate the discipline of starting our sentences with "in my model." In my model, you know, the following applies, or I think we should proceed as follows. Now, that is going to sound quite contrived. I really acknowledge that. And in my sibling conversation, I didn't use that. But we might use a softer version of that and say things like, in my way of thinking, the following. And it makes it less personal. We get a little bit of healthy detachment on our point of view or our way of seeing things. And so the difference in models can then become a source of learning. It can then be a source of creative tension. And instead of seeing the other person as an opponent or somebody we've got to kind of fight with or beat down with the power of our argument, we see the other person as bringing some kind of helpful constraint to our own thinking. So that's the word David Cantor uses, helpful constraint, when we've got what he would call model clash. And that orientation can help us think, actually, I'm missing something here, back to what Claus was saying about being open to the possibility that there are flaws in my way of thinking, or that my understanding of a situation might actually be incomplete. And so by engaging in that cross-model conversation, I share what my model says about care for elderly people, and then I hear what your model is of care for elderly people, and I might, in that exchange, get to see things and get to appreciate things that I hadn't seen when I was just thinking on my own. And that makes me less defensive. It makes me more open to the pushback that I could get from other people. So those are the principles of the cross-model conversation. And I'll just sort of say, back to the story with my siblings for a moment. We had a good dialogue amongst the four of us. There was some tension. Voices didn't get too raised. I came to see that in my model, which is one of really optimising autonomy for elderly people, if I can put it like that. So I think that my dad should still be driving, and so on. My other siblings' model of care for elderly people, which would be coming from a more protective place, wanting to put more care in place, wanting my dad to stop driving, I came to think through more carefully what the risks were of somebody in their mid-80s driving on the road. And actually, in our dialogue, we reached some middle ground, and we decided as a group of siblings that we would make the request, and all we can ever do is make requests. We can't dictate these things, that my dad would stop driving at night, that he would stop driving beyond the local area. And that was something that once we'd had our model clash, that all the siblings could agree on. And when I look back on that dialogue, that discussion, it was really helpful just to be not overly identified with my position, to just think, I have my model, my siblings have their model, and then we can talk through what the differences are in those models to hopefully find a way of being aligned, or of rowing in the same direction, back to the Lencioni quote. So that's our third tool of the cross-model conversation. Just checking. Thank you, Khaled. I see your message there. Understand you need to go. So we've got about 10 minutes left. And as I said, it would be great just to open this out, hear your questions, your reflections, anything you'd like to add, any stories you might like to share. We're a small group, so you're just welcome to unmute yourself, and just love to hear your response, particularly to these 3 tools for turning tension into triumph. How's it landing with you?
So I think maybe just because we're coming close to time, so if you are interested in learning more, then Sarah and I have a 2-day open program coming up in March. And when I send out the recording of this webinar, then I'll also include a link where you can read more about the webinar. And there's still some places, so if you're interested, do contact us. And also, if you think about, if you know anybody where you think they would benefit from it, we would very much appreciate you sharing the link. So send it to your neighbor, for example, or to anybody else that you think might benefit from learning some of these tools. Maybe someone you know who's has recently complained to you about a stuck situation at work. Do you have anything else you want to say about it, Sarah? Or
thank you very much, Klaus. And you'll get a follow-on email from us, from Klaus as well. And thank you very much for participating today. I hope you found it useful.